You ever trust a machine more than your own eyes, son? The old man's voice was low, rough like gravel under a slow tire, but it cut clean through the steady hum of the cabin. At 30,000 feet above the Midwest, where the sky stretched wide and pale and endless, most of the passengers were asleep, their heads tilted against windows or resting on folded arms, unaware that something subtle had shifted in the air. In the cockpit, First Officer Daniel Brooks leaned back in his seat, one hand resting near the controls, the other tapping idly against his thigh as the autopilot held their course. The dashboard glowed with calm, confident greens, every system reading normal, every indicator whispering the same quiet lie. Everything is fine. Behind the reinforced door, in seat 14A, James Holloway sat upright, his weathered hands folded loosely in his lap, his pale blue eyes fixed not on the cabin, but on the thin line where sky met cloud outside the oval window. He didn't move much, didn't speak, didn't draw attention. Just another elderly passenger in a worn brown jacket, the kind you could find in any small-town thrift store, the kind no one looked at twice. But his gaze never drifted. It tracked something no one else seemed to notice. The faint tremor in the wings came first, a barely perceptible shiver that rippled through the fuselage like a breath held too long. A few overhead bins rattled softly. Somewhere in the back, a glass clinked against plastic. Most passengers slept through it. In the aisle, flight attendant Mia Collins paused mid-step, her trained smile fading just slightly as she felt the vibration under her feet. She'd flown this route dozens of times. She knew the difference between normal air and something off. In the cockpit, Brooks barely glanced at the instruments. Just light chop, he muttered, more to himself than anyone else, his tone casual, almost bored. Autopilot's got it. Captain Reynolds gave a short nod without looking up from his checklist. The machine said everything was fine. That was enough for them. Back in 14A, Holloway's fingers tightened just slightly against each other. His eyes narrowed, not in fear, but in recognition. The clouds ahead weren't right. They layered too clean, too smooth, like glass stacked on glass. To anyone else, it was just another patch of sky. To him, it was a memory waiting to happen. He leaned forward, just a fraction, enough to feel the subtle shift in pressure, the way the air pressed differently against the aircraft's skin. His head tilted, listening, not to the cabin chatter or the engines, but to the silence between them. Mia noticed him then. The way he didn't react like the others. The way he wasn't surprised by the tremor. He was expecting it. She hesitated, then stepped closer. "Sir, are you all right?" she asked softly, her voice careful, professional. Holloway turned his head slowly toward her. His expression was calm, almost distant, like he was looking through her instead of at her. "You might want to tell them up front," he said, his voice steady, unhurried. "We're about to cross something they won't see on that screen." Mia blinked, caught off guard. "Sir." Before she could press further, another ripple passed through the aircraft, stronger this time. Not violent, not alarming, but wrong. The kind of wrong that didn't belong at cruising altitude. In the cockpit, Brooks frowned slightly now, his fingers hovering closer to the controls. The autopilot adjusted, compensating, smoothing things out before they could escalate. He smirked faintly, reassured. "See," he said. "System handles it." But in seat 14A, James Holloway didn't relax. His gaze returned to the horizon, to that invisible line where the sky held its breath. And for just a moment, the reflection in the window didn't show an old man in a worn jacket. It showed something older, something that had seen this exact sky turn unforgiving before. He exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly. "Not this time," he murmured under his breath, too quiet for anyone to hear. The plane moved forward anyway, steady and blind, straight toward a part of the sky that was about to remind everyone on board that not all dangers come with warnings, and not all warnings come from machines. The second tremor did not feel like turbulence anymore. It felt deliberate, as if the air itself had tightened its grip around the aircraft, and this time more passengers stirred, a low ripple of uneasy murmurs spreading through the cabin as overhead lights flickered just slightly before stabilizing again. And in the aisle, Mia Collins steadied herself with a hand on the seatback, her eyes moving instinctively toward the cockpit door, and then back to seat 14A, where James Holloway had not moved at all, not even an inch, his posture unchanged, his gaze still locked on that thin, invisible boundary outside the window, and it was that stillness that unsettled her more than the shaking. Because everyone else reacted, everyone else adjusted, but he remained anchored, like he had already been through this moment before and knew exactly how far it would go. Up front, Daniel Brooks shifted in his seat now, the earlier confidence thinning just enough to let irritation slip through. His fingers brushing the controls as the autopilot made another micro-adjustment, the system compensating, recalculating, smoothing out variables faster than any human could. And yet something about the rhythm was off, not wrong enough to trigger alarms, but not right enough to ignore. And he glanced at the weather radar again. A clean sweep of green with no significant returns, no storm cells, no visible threat, just open sky. And that made him frown more deeply because the aircraft did not shake like this for no reason. Captain Reynolds finally looked up fully, his eyes narrowing slightly as he felt the subtle but persistent irregularity in the airframe, the kind that did not show up on screens but spoke through vibration, through pressure, through instinct. And he reached forward, adjusting a setting, double-checking the data, then said quietly, "Feels like a shear layer." But Brooks shook his head almost immediately, dismissive. "There is nothing on radar, Captain. It is clean out there." His tone carrying that quiet edge of someone who trusted the system more than sensation, more than intuition. Back in the cabin, Mia made her decision and stepped closer again to Holloway, lowering her voice. "Sir, what exactly did you mean by that?" And this time he did not look at her right away. Instead, he tilted his head slightly as another wave passed under the aircraft, stronger now, the wings flexing just enough to catch the light differently. A subtle shift that most would miss, but not him, never him. And then he spoke, calm as ever. "There is a split in the air ahead, two layers moving against each other, one rising, one dropping, and your pilots are flying straight into the seam." Mia felt a chill she could not explain, not fear exactly, but something close to it, because his words did not sound like a guess. They sounded like a report, like something already confirmed. She hesitated, glancing again toward the cockpit, knowing protocol, knowing boundaries, but also knowing that something about this was not normal. And before she could respond, the aircraft dipped just slightly. A quick, smooth drop of a few feet that made a couple of passengers gasp and clutch their armrests. The kind of movement that was still within safety margins, but sharp enough to break the illusion of calm. In the cockpit, Brooks exhaled sharply now, his jaw tightening as he reached to disengage part of the autopilot, his hand moving faster, more deliberate. "All right, that is enough," he muttered, taking partial manual control, the aircraft responding immediately to his input, smoothing out again under human hands. And for a brief second, he felt vindicated, in control, until the next vibration hit, not stronger, but different, layered, complex, like two opposing currents brushing against each other along the fuselage. And that was when the confidence cracked just slightly. Captain Reynolds leaned forward, eyes scanning beyond the instruments now, looking through the windshield into the vast pale sky, where nothing seemed out of place, and yet everything felt wrong. And he said quietly, "I do not like this." And behind the cockpit door, James Holloway finally shifted. Just a small movement as his hand slid toward the inside pocket of his worn jacket, his fingers brushing against something old, something familiar, something that did not belong to modern systems or digital screens. And his eyes, pale and steady, reflected the sky outside as if it were a map he had memorized decades ago. And under his breath, so quietly it barely existed, he said, "You are already late." The cockpit felt smaller now, not physically, but in the way tension compresses space, turning every sound sharper, every movement more deliberate, and Daniel Brooks could feel it in his hands as they tightened around the controls, the aircraft no longer gliding effortlessly, but responding with a subtle resistance. As if the sky itself had thickened, the instruments still showed normal ranges, altitude steady at 30,000 feet, airspeed within limits, engine readings clean, but the sensation beneath it all told a different story, one that did not translate into numbers, and that disconnect began to irritate him more than concern him, because irritation was easier to control than uncertainty. "There is nothing out there," he said again, more firmly this time, as if repetition could make it true. But Captain Reynolds did not answer right away, his gaze fixed ahead, scanning the horizon with the kind of attention that came from years of flying before systems became this advanced, when pilots learned to trust what they felt as much as what they saw. And after a long second, he reached forward and adjusted their heading by a few degrees, just enough to test the air, just enough to feel the difference. And for a brief moment the vibration eased, not gone, but softened, like stepping out of a current into shallower water. Brooks noticed it immediately and frowned. That was coincidence, he said. But his voice had lost some of its edge. Behind the cockpit door, Mia Collins had already made up her mind, and protocol or not, she moved quickly down the aisle toward the front, her steps controlled but urgent, the kind of urgency that did not create panic but carried weight. And as she reached the galley, she picked up the interphone, hesitated only a fraction of a second, then pressed the call button. Inside the cockpit, a soft chime cut through the layered hum of systems, and Brooks glanced at it with visible annoyance. "Not now," he muttered, but Reynolds gestured for him to take it, and with a quick exhale Brooks tapped the switch. "Cockpit," he said. Mia's voice came through, steady but lower than usual. "Captain, I think you should hear this." And Brooks rolled his eyes slightly, already preparing to dismiss whatever concern a flight attendant might have about routine turbulence. But then she added, "There is a passenger who says we are about to enter a vertical shear zone that is not showing on radar." And that made Reynolds look over sharply, his attention snapping into focus, while Brooks let out a short, incredulous breath. "A passenger," he repeated, unable to hide the skepticism. "We are taking flight advice from seat 14 now." In the cabin, James Holloway watched the sky shift, not visibly, not in any way that cameras or instruments would capture, but in the subtle distortion of distance, the way layers of air bent light just enough to create a faint shimmer along the horizon. And his fingers closed around the object inside his jacket pocket, the worn edges familiar against his skin, grounding him not in the present, but in a pattern he had seen before, a pattern that always began this way, quiet, almost invisible, until it was not. Another tremor passed through the aircraft, sharper now, a quick drop followed by an immediate lift, enough to pull a few startled sounds from the cabin. And this time, even Brooks did not speak right away, his eyes flicking rapidly between instruments and windshield, searching for confirmation that refused to appear. And Reynolds leaned forward, his voice lower, more decisive. "Ask her what exactly," he said. And Brooks hesitated, just long enough to show the internal conflict between pride and caution, before pressing the interphone again. "Repeat that," he said. Mia glanced back down the aisle, meeting Holloway's eyes for just a second, and there was something in that look, something steady and certain that made her voice firmer when she answered. "He said you are flying into two opposing air layers, one rising and one descending, and that the seam is directly ahead of us." And in the cockpit, silence settled for a heartbeat, not empty, but heavy, and Reynolds slowly adjusted their heading again, a few more degrees this time, testing, feeling, and once more the vibration shifted, not gone, but changing. Enough to make Brooks notice, enough to make him stop arguing. Back in seat 14A, Holloway leaned back slightly, his eyes never leaving the sky, and under his breath, calm and measured, he said, "You can still move around it, if you listen." But the aircraft continued forward, caught between instinct and system, between experience and data, and somewhere above and ahead, unseen by radar and ignored by algorithms, the sky waited, silent and patient, for the moment when hesitation would no longer be enough. The shift came without warning, not as a violent jolt but as a sudden absence of stability, as if the air beneath the aircraft had simply stepped aside, and for a fraction of a second the entire cabin seemed to float in a quiet, weightless pause before the nose dipped just enough to pull a collective breath from every passenger on board. Overhead bins rattled harder now, a sharper clatter that echoed through the fuselage, and a few seatbelt signs flickered as if reacting to something deeper. Then turbulence, something structural in the air itself. In the cockpit, Daniel Brooks reacted instantly, his hands tightening as he adjusted pitch and thrust, his training kicking in before thought could catch up. But this was not the smooth correction he expected. The aircraft did not respond with clean predictability. Instead, it felt layered, like trying to steer through two currents moving in opposite directions at the same time. And that was when the certainty finally broke. That is not normal. he said. The words quieter now, stripped of arrogance, and Captain Reynolds did not respond with reassurance, only with action, his hand moving to override more of the automated systems, his voice calm but firm. We are taking full manual, and the autopilot disengaged with a soft, unmistakable tone that seemed louder than it should have been in that moment. Back in the cabin, Mia Collins had already braced herself near the forward galley, her eyes locked on the aisle as a few passengers looked around in confusion, some gripping armrests, others peering out windows as if expecting to see something that would explain the sensation. But the sky remained deceptively calm, pale blue, stretching endlessly with no visible threat, no storm, no warning. In seat 14A, James Holloway closed his eyes for a brief second, not in fear, but in recognition, because this was the moment the seam revealed itself, not on instruments, not on radar, but in the way the aircraft struggled to find a single truth in conflicting air. And when he opened them again, there was no hesitation left. His hand moved inside his jacket and pulled out a small, worn device, its surface scratched from years of use, its design simple, analog, out of place in a world of digital precision. And he held it for a moment as if weighing not the object, but the decision behind it. In the cockpit, Brooks fought the controls through another layered shift, the aircraft rising slightly as one current lifted it while another tried to pull it down, and Reynolds adjusted their heading again, more aggressively this time, chasing stability that refused to settle. And for the first time Brooks looked past the instruments, out into the sky, searching for something he could not define, and finding nothing. The interphone chimed again, sharper this time, and Brooks answered without hesitation. "What is it?" His voice no longer dismissive, and Mia's response came immediately. "He says you are in the seam now, and that you need to change altitude or heading immediately." And there was no question in her tone anymore, only urgency, because whatever doubt she had before had been replaced by what she was feeling under her feet. Brooks exhaled slowly, the weight of decision pressing in, and he glanced at Reynolds, who held his gaze for a brief second before nodding once. A small, decisive movement that said more than words, and Brooks spoke into the interphone again. "Ask him which direction." The words deliberate, controlled, and back in 14A, Mia turned, her eyes meeting Holloway's. And for the first time there was no distance between them, no uncertainty, just a direct line of trust. Holloway looked past her, through the cabin, through the aircraft, into the invisible structure of the sky itself, and then he spoke, calm and exact. 5 degrees starboard, climb 500 feet, do it now before the upper layer collapses. And Mia did not question it, did not filter it. She turned back immediately, repeating every word with precision. And in the cockpit Brooks listened, every instinct he had built through training pushing against what he was about to do. And yet something deeper, something older than systems and protocols, told him that this was no longer about pride. It was about timing. He moved the controls, adjusting heading, increasing climb, the aircraft responding slowly at first, then more cleanly as they angled away from the unseen seam. And for a moment nothing changed, the vibration still there, the tension still present, and then gradually, almost reluctantly, the resistance eased, the layered pressure thinning, the aircraft settling into a smoother path as if it had finally slipped between the conflicting currents. In the cabin, the rattling softened, the hum of the engines returned to its steady rhythm, and a quiet spread through the passengers, not full relief, but a release of something they could not name. In the cockpit, Brooks stared at the instruments, then out at the sky, then back again, searching for confirmation of what had just happened and finding none, and that absence said everything. Behind him, the interphone remained silent, but in seat 14A, James Holloway lowered the small device back into his pocket, his eyes still on the horizon, because he knew something the others did not. They had not escaped it yet. They had only been given a path, and somewhere above them, beyond what any civilian system could see, something had already heard his voice, even though he had not spoken into the open air yet. The calm did not feel like safety. It felt like a pause, the kind that comes before something larger reveals itself. And in the cockpit Daniel Brooks could feel it in the way the controls had gone from resisting to almost too smooth, as if the aircraft had slipped into a narrow corridor where the air moved differently, more controlled, more precise, but not naturally so. He kept his hand steady, eyes moving between the instruments and the open sky ahead, searching for confirmation of the path they had just taken, but the screens remained indifferent, clean lines and stable numbers offering no explanation for what they had just passed through, and that absence lingered heavier than any warning would have. Captain Reynolds leaned back slightly, not relaxed, but recalibrating, his mind already stepping through what had happened, replaying the sequence, the adjustments, the timing, and most of all the voice that had guided them from the cabin. And after a long second, he said quietly, "We need to know who that man is," and this time Brooks did not argue, because whatever pride had been there before had been replaced by something else, something quieter, something closer to respect, or at least uncertainty. Back in the cabin, the passengers were settling again, some exchanging nervous glances, others forcing small smiles as if to reassure themselves that the moment had passed. But Mia Collins did not return to her routine. She stayed near the front, her attention drifting again and again to seat 14A, where James Holloway sat as still as before, his gaze still fixed beyond the aircraft, as if the sky had not finished speaking. She approached him once more, slower this time, more deliberate, and when she stopped beside him, she did not speak immediately. She simply waited, because something about him suggested that he would answer when it mattered, not before. Holloway did not look at her right away, his eyes tracking something distant, something that did not exist for anyone else on board, and then he said, almost to himself, "They adjusted the corridor," and Mia felt a quiet tension return, sharper than before. "Who did?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, and now he turned, meeting her eyes fully for the first time, and there was no confusion in his expression, no doubt, only a calm certainty that did not belong to a passenger. "The ones who listen for voices like mine," he said, in the cockpit. A soft tone broke the silence again, not from the interphone this time, but from the communication panel, a channel that had not been active seconds ago now flickering with an incoming signal, and Brooks frowned, reaching for the control. "We are not scheduled for contact here," he muttered. But Reynolds was already leaning forward, his focus sharp. "Open it," he said, and Brooks hesitated only a fraction before switching the channel live. The response did not come immediately, just a brief stretch of static, controlled, measured, like someone deciding whether to speak, and then a voice, clear, precise, carrying a weight that did not belong to casual communication, filled the cockpit. "Civilian aircraft on Vector 310. Confirm your current heading and altitude." And Brooks straightened instinctively, answering with professional clarity, giving their position, their altitude, their flight number, his tone steady but edged with curiosity, because this was not standard traffic control, this was something else. There was a pause on the line, longer this time, and then the voice returned, slightly altered, more focused. "Maintain current vector, adjust altitude plus 200 feet. You are entering a controlled corridor." And Brooks glanced at Reynolds, confusion and caution mixing in his expression, because there had been no prior notice, no coordination, nothing in their briefing about restricted airspace here. And yet the authority in that voice was unmistakable. Reynolds nodded once, slowly, and Brooks made the adjustment, the aircraft climbing just slightly, the movement smooth, precise, and as it leveled off the air shifted again, not violently, but with a clarity that felt engineered, like slipping into a channel carved through chaos. Back in seat 14A, James Holloway closed his eyes for a brief moment, not in relief, but in acknowledgement, because he recognized the pattern now, the response, the timing, and the silence that followed, and under his breath, almost inaudible, he said, "You heard me." Even though he had not yet spoken into any open frequency, not yet given the signal that should have triggered such a reaction. And that was when he knew for certain. They had been listening long before he reached for the radio, long before this flight ever left the ground. The voice on the radio did not repeat itself, it did not need to, because the authority behind it lingered in the cockpit long after the transmission ended, settling into the silence like a presence rather than a sound. And Daniel Brooks found himself staring at the communication panel for a second longer than necessary, as if expecting more instructions to follow. But none came, only the steady hum of the aircraft now moving through air that felt unnaturally smooth, almost guided. Captain Reynolds exhaled slowly, his eyes still forward, his mind no longer questioning whether something unusual was happening, but trying to understand the scale of it. And after a moment he spoke, his voice low and controlled. That was not standard control. And Brooks nodded, the earlier edge in his demeanor gone, replaced by something quieter, more attentive. No, sir, he said, his hands still on the controls even though the aircraft no longer resisted, as if letting go might break whatever fragile alignment they had entered. Outside the windshield, the sky remained deceptively calm, pale, and endless. But there was a subtle difference now, a faint shimmer at the edges of visibility, like heat rising from asphalt on a summer day. Except this was at 30,000 feet where such distortions did not belong, and Brooks noticed it, not fully understanding what he was seeing, only that it matched the sensation beneath the aircraft, a controlled channel through something far less stable. Back in the cabin, Mia Collins felt it too, not as turbulence, but as the absence of it, a sudden smoothness that felt deliberate rather than natural, and she glanced again toward James Holloway, who sat exactly as before, his posture unchanged, his gaze steady, as if he had expected this transition all along. And that was what finally pushed her past hesitation, because this was no longer a coincidence, it was a pattern. She stepped closer, her voice careful but direct. Sir, who are they? And Holloway did not answer immediately, his eyes still on the horizon, following something only he could trace. And when he did speak, his voice carried a weight that did not belong to speculation. They are the ones who watch the sky when the system stops seeing it, he said. Simple, precise, and Mia felt a quiet tension settle deeper, because that answer explained nothing, and yet somehow explained everything. In the cockpit, Brooks reached for the communication panel again, his hesitation gone now, replaced by a need to understand. Unknown control. This is civilian flight requesting identification, he said, his voice professional but edged with curiosity. And for a moment there was only silence, the kind that stretches just long enough to make a response feel intentional rather than automatic. And then the voice returned, the same clarity, the same controlled tone. Maintain current vector. You are being monitored. And the line went quiet again, leaving no room for follow-up, no channel for questions, only instruction. Brooks leaned back slightly, absorbing that, his mind running through protocols that did not apply here, scenarios that did not fit. And finally he glanced at Reynolds. Being monitored by who? He asked, not expecting an answer. And Reynolds shook his head slowly, his gaze still forward. By someone who already knew we were here, he said. And that realization settled heavily between them. Behind the cockpit door, James Holloway's hand moved once more to his jacket pocket, his fingers brushing the small radio device again. And this time he did not hesitate, because the pattern had confirmed itself. The response had come before the call, and that meant only one thing. The channel was already open, whether he used it or not. He pulled the device out slowly, the worn surface catching the cabin light, an object out of time in a space, defined by modern precision, and Mia watched him, her breath held without realizing it, because something about the moment felt important, not dramatic, not loud, but significant in a way she could not explain. Holloway turned the device in his hand, his thumb resting on a switch that had likely not been used in years, and for a brief second his eyes closed, not in doubt, but in memory, as if aligning the present with something far older, something that had once defined moments like this. Then, he opened them again, calm, steady, and without looking at anyone he raised the device slightly, his voice low but clear as he spoke into it, not loud, not urgent, but with the kind of precision that carried across distances no civilian frequency was meant to reach. Raven 1 requesting corridor confirmation. And for a fraction of a second nothing happened, just the quiet hum of the aircraft moving through its invisible path. And then, almost immediately, the cockpit communication panel lit up again, the incoming signal sharper this time, faster, as if it had been waiting for that exact phrase. And in that instant, every doubt that had lingered in the minds of those who had heard him vanished, replaced by a single undeniable truth. This was not coincidence. This was recognition. The response did not come with hesitation this time. It came instantly, sharply, as if the sky itself had been waiting for that exact voice, that exact call. And in the cockpit, the communication panel lit up with a clarity that cut through every layer of uncertainty that had built over the past minutes. And before Daniel Brooks could even reach for the control, the channel opened on its own. The same voice returning, but no longer neutral, no longer distant, now carrying something unmistakable. Beneath its precision, recognition, Raven 1, corridor confirmed. It said, each word deliberate, controlled, but weighted with a respect that had not been there before, and Brooks froze for just a fraction of a second, his hand hovering mid-air as the meaning of what he had just heard settled into place, not fully understood, but impossible to ignore. Captain Reynolds leaned forward slowly, his eyes narrowing not in confusion, but in focus, as if aligning pieces that had been scattered moments ago, and he spoke quietly, not into the radio, but into the space between them. They know him. And Brooks did not respond, because there was nothing to argue with anymore. Outside the cockpit glass, the sky shifted again, not violently, not dramatically, but with a subtle clarity, the faint distortion ahead becoming more defined, like a corridor drawn through layers of invisible pressure. And for the first time since this began, the aircraft did not feel like it was pushing through the air. It felt like it was being guided along a path that had already been cleared. Back in the cabin, Mia Collins stood motionless for a second, her eyes fixed on James Holloway, the small device still in his hand, his posture unchanged, his expression calm, as if the confirmation he had just received was expected, routine even, and that realization sent a quiet chill through her, because nothing about this felt routine to anyone else on board. The cabin remained quiet now, not because the passengers understood what was happening, but because the absence of movement, the sudden smoothness of the flight, had lulled them into a fragile sense of safety, unaware that something far beyond their awareness had just shifted into place. In the cockpit, Brooks finally moved, his hand closing over the communication control, his voice steady but altered, stripped of its earlier certainty, replaced by something more careful, more deliberate. Unknown control, confirm identity, he said, the words precise, professional. But the response came without the information he was asking for, only the continuation of instruction. Maintain current heading, hold altitude, escort inbound. And that last phrase settled heavily in the cockpit, because it carried implications that did not belong to civilian flight. Brooks turned his head slightly toward Reynolds, his voice lower now. Escort, he repeated, and Reynolds nodded once, slowly, his eyes already scanning the sky beyond the windshield, searching not for answers, but for confirmation. It came seconds later, not on instruments, not on radar, but in the distance, two small shapes cutting through the pale blue horizon, fast, precise, closing the distance with controlled speed, their silhouettes growing sharper with every passing moment until their form became unmistakable, sleek military aircraft, moving with purpose, aligning themselves with the civilian plane as if this had been planned long before any of this unfolded. Brooks stared, the disbelief no longer hidden, because this was no longer abstract, no longer a voice on a radio or a feeling in the air. This was visible, undeniable, and it was happening because of a man sitting quietly in seat 14A. The fighters moved into position with flawless precision, one on each side, maintaining distance but matching speed perfectly, their presence silent but overwhelming, a visual confirmation of authority that no system could replicate. In the cabin, a few passengers began to notice, heads turning toward the windows, pointing, whispering, confusion mixing with awe as they caught sight of the aircraft pacing them through the sky, but none of them understood why. Mia turned back to Holloway, her voice barely a whisper now. "What did you just do?" And he did not answer immediately, his eyes still on the horizon, watching the alignment, the spacing, the movement of the escorts as if checking their work. And then he spoke, calm, measured. "I reminded them I was still up here." And the simplicity of that answer carried more weight than any explanation could have. In the cockpit, the radio crackled one more time, and this time the voice was different, deeper, older, carrying the unmistakable tone of command that did not need to announce itself. "Raven 1, this is Langley Command. Corridor secured. You are clear to proceed." And for a moment, the cockpit fell completely silent, because both men understood, without needing confirmation, that the call sign they had just heard was not a coincidence, not a guess, but a name that had reached far beyond the aircraft, far beyond civilian airspace, into a system that responded not to requests, but to identity. And in that silence, Daniel Brooks finally looked back, through the closed cockpit door, as if he could somehow see the man behind it, the one who had turned the sky itself into something that listened. The presence of the escorts changed everything, not in a dramatic way, not with sudden movement or sound, but in the quiet authority they brought to the air around them, as if the sky itself had acknowledged a higher order and adjusted accordingly. And inside the cockpit, Daniel Brooks could feel it in the way his hands relaxed just slightly on the controls, not because he understood what was happening, but because whatever had been uncertain before was now being handled by something far beyond his reach. The two aircraft held their positions flawlessly, one off the left wing, one off the right, their distance precise, their motion synchronized with a level of control that made the civilian aircraft feel almost anchored between them. And Brooks could not look away, his eyes drawn again and again to the sleek silhouettes pacing them through the pale blue expanse, their presence silent but overwhelming. Captain Reynolds remained composed, but there was a shift in his posture, a subtle straightening, as if instinctively responding to the authority now surrounding them, and he reached forward, adjusting their heading slightly to maintain alignment within the corridor, his movements measured, deliberate, because whatever path they were on now was no longer theirs alone to define. The radio remained quiet after the last transmission, but the silence was no longer empty. It carried weight, expectation, as if every system on board was now part of something larger, something coordinated beyond civilian control. Back in the cabin, the change had not gone unnoticed. Passengers leaned toward the windows, pointing, whispering, some pulling out phones, though many simply stared, trying to understand why military aircraft were flying alongside them at cruising altitude, and the usual calm of commercial flight had shifted into something else, something charged with quiet awe. Mia Collins stood in the aisle, her attention no longer on the passengers, but fixed once again on James Holloway, because she understood now, not the details, not the full picture, but the source, and that was enough. Holloway remained seated, the small radio device now resting loosely in his hand, his gaze steady on the horizon, not on the escorts, not on the reactions around him, because to him this was not spectacle, it was confirmation, a system responding exactly as it had been trained to do, even after all this time. Mia stepped closer, lowering herself slightly to meet his level, her voice calm but carrying a quiet intensity. "They are here because of you," she said, not as a question, but as a realization, and Holloway finally shifted his gaze toward her, his expression unchanged, neither proud nor dismissive, simply acknowledging what was already obvious. "They are here because they were always meant to be," he replied, his tone even, as if the distinction mattered. In the cockpit, Brooks adjusted the trim slightly, his movements more careful now, more aware, because every action felt like it was being observed, measured against a standard he did not fully understand, and he glanced again at the radar, at the instruments, at the clear sky that still showed nothing unusual. And the disconnect between what he saw and what was happening pressed deeper into his thoughts. "Sir," he said quietly, his voice no longer carrying any trace of earlier arrogance, "what exactly are we in right now?" And Reynolds did not answer immediately, his eyes fixed ahead, following the subtle line of the corridor that could not be seen but could be felt. And after a moment he spoke. "We are in something that was built for people who know how to ask for it." And Brooks absorbed that, the words settling into place alongside everything else he had witnessed, forming a picture that was still incomplete but no longer fragmented. Outside, the escorts adjusted their positions slightly, a minor correction, but executed with such precision that it reinforced the sense of coordination, of control, and for a brief moment one of the pilots turned his aircraft just enough that the canopy caught the sunlight, a flash of reflection that reached the cabin windows, and several passengers reacted to it, small gasps, quiet exclamations. But Holloway did not move, because he had seen that signal before, not as a greeting, not as a display, but as acknowledgement. The aircraft continued forward, steady within the corridor, the earlier instability now completely gone, replaced by a smooth, controlled progression that felt almost deliberate, And in that calm, the weight of what had happened began to settle over everyone who understood even a fraction of it. Because this was no longer a question of weather or coincidence. This was structure, response, recognition. In the cockpit, Brooks finally leaned back. Slightly, his grip loosening just enough to show that he trusted the path they were on, even if he did not understand it. And he glanced once more toward the closed cockpit door, as if trying to see through it, to reconcile the image of the quiet passenger with the reality unfolding around them. And for the first time since the flight began, he did not see an interruption, or a distraction, or even a stranger. He saw a presence, something that carried weight without needing to show it. And behind that door, in seat 14A, James Holloway simply sat, watching the sky, as the world around him adjusted to a name that had not been spoken out loud in years, a name that did not need introduction, only recognition. The corridor held steady, not widening, not narrowing, just existing with a quiet certainty that seemed immune to everything outside it. And inside the cockpit, Daniel Brooks no longer questioned it. He followed it, his hands moving with a precision that came from trust rather than control, because somewhere along the last several minutes the balance had shifted, from commanding the aircraft to cooperating with something larger guiding it. The escorts maintained their positions with flawless discipline, never drifting, never overcorrecting, their presence constant and exact. And as the civilian aircraft moved forward, the faint distortion at the edges of the sky began to thin, not disappearing all at once, but easing gradually, like a boundary being crossed one invisible line at a time. Captain Reynolds monitored the transition closely, his eyes tracking both instruments and horizon. And when the air finally settled into something that felt completely natural again, not engineered, not layered, just open sky, he exhaled quietly, the tension leaving his shoulders in a controlled release. The radio remained silent for a few moments, and then the same command voice returned, calm and precise. Raven 1, corridor exit confirmed. You are clear of controlled airspace. And this time there was something else beneath the words, not just authority, but acknowledgement. As if a task had been completed exactly as intended. Brooks listened, his gaze steady, and he responded automatically with their flight identification, but the words felt smaller now, routine in a moment that was anything but. And when the transmission ended, the escorts adjusted once more, a subtle shift in formation, signaling departure. Outside the windows, the two aircraft peeled away with smooth, deliberate motion, one banking slightly left, the other right, their paths diverging with perfect symmetry before accelerating forward and disappearing into the pale distance, leaving behind nothing but open sky and the fading echo of their presence. In the cabin, passengers watched in silence as the escorts vanished, the brief spectacle already turning into something unreal, something they would struggle to explain later. And a quiet murmur began to rise, not loud, not chaotic, just the sound of people trying to process what they had seen. Mia Collins stood still for a moment longer, her eyes following the empty space where the aircraft had been, and then she turned slowly back towards seat 14A, because she knew that was where the answer remained. James Holloway had already lowered the small radio device, slipping it back into his jacket pocket with the same calm motion he had used to take it out, as if returning something to rest after its purpose had been fulfilled, and his gaze had softened slightly, no longer searching the horizon, but simply observing it, the way one does when the work is done. Mia stepped closer, her voice quieter now, not uncertain, but respectful in a way it had not been before. Is it over? She asked, and Holloway gave a small nod, almost imperceptible. For them, yes, he said, and the phrasing lingered in her mind, because it suggested something larger than the moment they had just lived through. In the cockpit, Brooks finally leaned back fully, his hands resting lightly on the controls as the aircraft continued on its assigned route. Now completely stable, completely ordinary, and yet nothing about it felt the same. And after a long silence he spoke, not to the radio, not to any system, but to Reynolds. He saved us before we even knew we needed it. And Reynolds did not look at him, his eyes still forward, but he nodded once, a quiet acknowledgement of a truth that did not require elaboration. The flight continued, altitude steady, course unchanged, the routine returning piece by piece. But beneath it all there remained a shift, subtle but permanent, in the understanding of everyone who had been aware enough to notice. Back in the cabin, Holloway rested his hands once more in his lap, his posture unchanged, his presence returning to what it had been at the beginning, unremarkable to those who did not know what to look for, invisible in the way that true experience often is. And he closed his eyes briefly, not from fatigue, but from a quiet sense of completion. Outside, the sky stretched endlessly, calm and open, giving no sign of what had passed through it moments before. No trace of the corridor, no echo of the voices, only the steady forward motion of a single aircraft carrying its passengers toward their destination. And in that quiet, one truth remained, unspoken but undeniable. Some names are not called often, but when they are, the sky itself listens.